Many European countries were some of the worst hit by COVID-19 when it first swept the world last year.
The World Health Organization says Europe is now the epicenter.
Spain now has more deaths than China.
Europe's response to the pandemic and the vaccine rollout has been criticised for being disorganised and slow. But would the outcome have been different if Europe had more female leaders?
I think, out of the 19 attributes associated with leadership to deal with the pandemic, on 13 out of 19, women actually come ahead of men.
Christine Lagarde, president of the European Central Bank, spoke to Zanny Minton-Beddoes, the Economist editor-in-chief, about the long-term damage of COVID-19 in Europe.
What do you see as the longer-term scarring consequences of this? And I'm thinking, for example, of something that I know you have been very concerned about long before the pandemic, which is the widening of inequality that we've seen around the world. It's something you raised the alarm on when you were at the IMF very, very effectively. In so many ways, this pandemic has not just exposed existing inequalities, it's worsened them. How much does that worry you? And frankly, what do we need to do about it?
I think it raises the question of what kind of economy are we going to land in? I don't want to say go back to, because I think that the economy that we will land in, that will have morphed into when the pandemic is over, is going to be different from what we've experienced pre-pandemic. So I think the way in which we buy, we pay, we learn, we look after our health will be different, and probably for good. So that's one of the good outcome, if you will, of the transformation that we are seeing. Now, if you look at the not so positive outcome, clearly there has been a worsening of inequalities. And while it is not for a central bank to actually address and try to find the policies that will respond to the inequalities, I think it will be upon governments to identify the set of policies that will best respond to closing, reducing, addressing those inequalities. It won't surprise you, but I will mention women as those that have actually heavily suffered from the worsened inequalities caused by the pandemic, particularly because of the gray work, or the informal work, which is predominantly done by women and which are the first to go in situations that we're going through at the moment. But if you look at the proportion of women that are victim of the current furlough schemes, often followed by layoff, women are taking a much heavier burden than men. It's really documented now very clearly. If you look at the proportion of men, women who are working in those industries, particularly the service industries that are subject to social distancing and as a result are being hit first, predominantly women. You look at hospitality, you look at all those things. And if you look at those that are most exposed to the pandemic at the lower end of the scale, in the health sector in particular, you have many more women than men.
There's a kind of, I think, interesting debate going on right now, and that countries which had female leaders have done better in the pandemic. Now, we can discuss whether that, to what degree it is true, but certainly there is an argument that many are making that that's true. And you famously said if it had been Lehman sisters rather than Lehman brothers, the world would look very different after the financial crisis. Is there something about female leadership that is different? Would we have been better off if more countries had been led by women during this pandemic?
There's been a Harvard study that was just recently published. It's an analysis of the perception that people have had of the way in which the crisis was managed. And there is an overwhelming response that shows, again, it's perception that people have had, that shows that they feel that women had a better way to deal with the pandemic. I think, out of the 19 attributes associated with leadership to deal with the pandemic, on 13 out of 19, women actually come ahead of men. Now, is that to say that they have done a fabulous job? Probably not. Is it to say that they had attributes such as empathy, such as appreciating the fear that people had, such as reaching out, that was, dominant in their way of dealing with the crisis? Probably so. There are so fewer women than men actually in charge of those issues, the fact that many of them have been successful is also an indication that they're pretty damn good.
So what do you then do to get more women into those positions, to have more women in leadership?
Organizing, pipes into which women are supported, are trained, are experienced, are given role models during that period of time when you combine learning jobs and pushing yourself as well as having children, significant, on-site support and financed support made available. And at the end of the day, honestly, targets or quotas, depending on how, what is the level of tolerance of the organizations or the institutions. But simply saying, okay, if I have the choice between at the same quality level and training between a man and a woman, if I have 20% women and 80% man, I will pick the woman. And I look at back 10 years ago when I was finance minister, there was a law that was pushed in French parliament that required that ultimately 40% of board members in all French public companies should be women. 10 years later, they just celebrated the anniversary of this law. It is now the case. 40% of public companies in France, board members, are female. So to anybody who says, oh, terribly sorry, there are not enough competent female, not true. If you have to find them, you find them.
Europe is going to have, much less fiscal stimulus, and I think you've actually spoken about that in the past, than might have been anticipated. So, isn't it disappointing in the recent past what has happened? And perhaps more importantly, what will the knock-on effect of that be on the European economic outlook? It looks now as though Europe's going to have a slower, weaker recovery, certainly than the one anticipated in America.
And the fiscal response was weaker in Europe than it was in America. That's for sure. The automatic stabilizers in Europe are much larger, stronger, and provide better welfare and coverage than what exists in most American states, because a lot of those welfare benefits are actually handled at state levels. So we're really talking about different economies, but it is a fact that both member states and Europe at large should continue to provide fiscal support to our economies, at least throughout 2021 and probably beyond, depending on how the pandemic affects our economy, how the vaccination process is rolled out, how quickly herd immunity is attained, and how the race against the variants of the virus can be won by additional vaccinations or by additional therapies, and how our economies actually transform. Now, what is coming in 21 is what was agreed by the Europeans, and which is called this Pan-European Next Generation EU special funds, hopefully will be spent in the second half of 21 for the first tranches that are due to kickstart the investment, the focus on green, the focus on digital.
We have gone digital. The way we live, the way we work, the way we shop, the way you and I are now communicating has completely changed. And I guess then, what is the consequence of that for central banks? Has the pandemic shown the world that it is time to make a major switch to digital trade and e-commerce? And what do you think the banking landscape in particular looks like in a digital age? So, how fast are you going to change? And to be very specific, when are you going to introduce a digital currency at the ECB?
I think more and more are convinced that this is the way to go. We should have a digital currency, which will not exclude banknotes. We should have a digital currency that is respectful of privacy, which is not selling data, which is not exploiting the data of people that are using it. A digital currency that also uses the canal of banks, because banks will be part and parcel in that digital currency launch. And then we will have to refine it to the point that it is completely safe, secure, and can be used effectively with less cost, more security, as I said, respect for privacy of those that are using it, and on a voluntary basis. It's not to substitute existing payment means. So those who like banknotes will continue to use their banknotes. But those who want to use digital payment should be able to do so. It's hard to say, but I would say in the next 4 years, we should be there.
Thank you, Christine Lagarde. Lovely to speak with you.
I'm Miranda Johnson, Deputy Executive Editor at The Economist. If you'd like to read more of our coverage on the coronavirus, click on the link. You can also listen to our new podcast series about the global vaccine rollout. It's called The Jab, and you can find it wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for watching.